Welcome to this Religion Media Centre weekly Zoom briefing. And this week we're exploring everything that's been unleashed by the explosive interview which Harry and Meghan have given to Oprah Winfrey, which was on our television screens in this country last night. I think it's true to say that there's a sense of shock. Certainly we're being told there's a sense of shock in the royal family and in society at large at this unusual thing to have happened, and that people are taking sides. And from various headlines we've seen, for example, in the Washington Post, the explosive interview indicates racism lingers in the royal family. In the Guardian, the hand grenade Oprah interview shakes the royal family to its foundations and leaves members open to suspicion. In the Mail, by attacking the royal family in this imperious way, Harry and Meghan have come perilously close to obliterating the whole institution. So here to make sense of it, we're joined by a panel of experts. Stephen Bates, formerly the Royal and Religious Affairs correspondent of The Guardian. Hope you're there, Stephen. Dr. David Muir, the head of Whitelands College and senior lecturer in public theology and community engagement at the University of Roehampton, co-author of the first Black Church Political Manifesto. Dr. Bob Morris, working with Professor Robert Hazel at UCL on a project considering the changing role of the monarchy in the future. Canon Rosie Harper, Vicar of Great Missenden and chaplain to the Bishop of Buckingham. And Dr. Ted Harrison, former BBC Religious Affairs correspondent in the Diana years and author of 2 books on Diana and another defender of the faith. So I think, Ted, perhaps we can start with you, if that's okay. If you would like to unmute yourself. And how this is going to work is that I'll be talking to each panelist just very briefly to start with, and then hoping that you'll have a conversation amongst one another. If any people on the call want to put a question, please put it in the chat box, and we'd also welcome you to unmute your mic and put it in person yourself towards the end. But Ted, if I could start with you. You've written 2 books on the Diana period. I suppose the first obvious question to you is, how does this episode compare with what happened with Diana?
I see it all in a single continuum, really spanning the whole of the period of the reign of the Queen. Right at the start of the reign, the coronation, there was a concept of monarchy, which was totally different from the concept of monarchy that we have today.
Harrison.
Now it is something much more aligned with celebrity. In the past, it was a sacred institution. The monarch was anointed with holy oil, as described in the Old Testament. Zadok the priest and so on is the great coronation anthem. And through that period of 70 plus years, the monarchy has totally and utterly changed, with the exception of the Queen. Diana's life was almost the halfway point in this change, this evolution of the monarchy. Her particular experience was that she came in to the royal family representing so many of the old archetypes of monarchy. She had to be the virgin queen, the virgin bride destined to be the mother of the future queen. She then played on some of the ideas of the wounded healer and so on. And then when her death came about, there was a tremendous national shock. People began to realize how the whole institution of monarchy was changing. The Queen had to change gear and appear on screen and fly the flag at half-mast and so on. Now we've moved on to the next generation, and we've seen how the monarchy has evolved even further. And so that although it's the news of the day and it's a big revelation, all the rest of it, it's not really surprising what Meghan was saying. There are some of the old institutions still lingering on in attitudes, obviously. But at the same time, she's living in the era of celebrity. She's an American actress. She's come into an institution which is utterly alien to her. Some of the things of the old institution have survived, and she's found them quite astonishing and difficult to get her head around. Harry is caught actually in the cusp of this change. He has made a decision to move on. I think once the Queen's reign is over, there will be a sea change in the way we perceive monarchy, and the way in which the monarchy as an institution is organized.
I wonder if you're taking sides like everyone else in this, Ted, and you think that there's fault on both sides, or one is more to blame?
I have no view on who is to blame in this at all. What was very interesting was that Meghan was talking about some of her ideas, which were clearly way off beam. You know, she had no idea about George V's plans for the royal family not to have too many princes hanging around, and how that was changed. You know, she had to catch up on that. She had ideas about security, and security in an age of the internet, of course, is very different, because you've got these trolls peddling racism online, generating hate, as we saw obviously with the way in which Trump came to power and so on. So there's a very different set of things that she had to cope with. At the same time, I feel enormously sorry for members of the royal family who are, as Harry said, trapped in an old institution. They don't know the way out. They don't know any other life. So there's really no way in which you can blame people. You can just say, here are two individuals caught up in a massive sea change in what monarchy is all about.
Thank you, Ted. I wonder if I could just go to Stephen Bates, who I think has just joined us. Stephen, you were both a religious affairs correspondent and royal correspondent at The Guardian, which I'm not sure how many people have achieved that in their career. But as you look back at this, I wonder if I could ask you to reflect on the idea of the monarchy being sacred in some way. Professor Ian Bradley in Scotland, he unfortunately can't be with us today, but he wrote a book about this, God Save the Queen, the spiritual heart of the monarchy, and said that the power that the monarch had was spiritual, to lead, inspire, unite. It wasn't temporal, like as political power. And I wonder if, reflecting on that, you think that the events of the last week or so have dented that whole idea that the monarchy has any power at all, sacred or otherwise?
I always used to say when I was at The Guardian that I was the correspondent for church and state, two institutions The Guardian didn't really believe in. I read Ian's book some time ago. He used to be my tutor at Oxford years ago. I think it's the Queen sometimes seems to be almost the last person who really believes in that sacred link. And I certainly don't see much evidence of it in Harry and Meghan in the last few days. I think the monarchy has always been more secular than spiritual, maybe back beyond the Victorian age, it was more spiritual. The Queen takes her coronation oath and the link with the church very seriously. I think it's going to be more questionable whether Charles will do so. He's talked of maintaining the link. He's also in the past talked about being a head of faiths rather than the faith, defender of faiths, and faith rather than the faiths. And so I think the monarchy probably in the future is going to be as confused as British secular society is about the place of religion in society, especially given that fewer and fewer people attend certainly Church of England services. I speak as the husband of a curate. And religion generally, maybe partly the media's fault, is taken less seriously than it used to be.
How do you reflect on the events of the last week or so in terms of the way that the monarch is perceived and the threat to perhaps the establishment of the Church of England?
I'm sure around Harry and Meghan's breakfast table, they speak of little else. I mean, I really don't think that that came into a deep consideration of what they were planning to say and obviously wanted to get off their chests. I think clearly the events of the last week, the interview has been deeply damaging to the monarchy in the short term, but it's a very long-term institution. It will get over this. In the last 30 years, it's had quite a lot of problems in one way or another, mostly stemming from this sort of event. And the monarchy's chief problem is being ignored and being ridiculed. And this interview has certainly contributed to that.
Thank you, Stephen. Can I turn now to Canon Rosie Harper? Rosie, you're in Buckinghamshire, and you're chaplain to the Bishop of Buckingham there, and you're known to have views on various issues. And so I wonder if I can ask you a question in this respect. Working as you do with people in the pew in the Church of England, how do they regard the monarchy, the institution, the Queen? Is there a sense of respect, reverence, putting up with the fact that there's a tie between the two? How has this episode gone down with the ordinary person in the pew?
I think it's really interesting. The loyalty to the Queen is quite phenomenal. If you probe a little bit further and say, is that loyalty to the monarchy? I would suggest it's almost gone. So people say, I don't really believe in the monarchy. I think the way the country is being governed is really rather strange. But of course, we're not going to say or do anything until the Queen dies. So the personal sense of loyalty to this Queen is huge within church circles. What I'm observing, though, is that there's a kind of parallel that's being played out at the moment between what has been happening to the Church of England and what might be happening to the monarchy in terms of their role as the moral compass for the country. Justin Welby was horrified when he first went to the House of Lords to discover that far from the bishops being seen as the leading lights in the moral compass of the country, most people within the House of Lords saw these people as a drag. It was all guys at that time, of course, as a drag on the moral perspective of the country. And so the Church of England was bad on gays and on women, and also very racist. And it lost its profile as and almost its raison d'etre for being part of government because of that. And now this is beginning to happen to the monarchy as well. They are so closely interlinked. I mean, the whole way in which our country is governed and the fact that we still have lords at all, let alone bishops in the House of Lords, is all linked together. And once you start saying not just that they're old-fashioned or out of touch, but actually that there's a moral deficit in the way in which the monarchy behaves, then I think it begins to get very serious, because they're beginning to be seen as a drag on the thriving and the ethical thriving of the country, rather than someone who does leading.
So it's important for them to address accusations of racism then?
Extremely important, yes, yes. I think one of my favourite observations is that both the monarchy and the Church of England managed to stay afloat by saying absolutely nothing. It's extremely hard to get an answer out of the Church of England to any questions. And I think the same with the monarchy. You just keep quiet long enough and these pesky people would go away. But I don't think this subject will go away, not nationally and indeed not internationally. And people who would not normally have a lot of empathy for someone cast a bit as a celebrity in the way Meghan has been, actually do have empathy for the way in which she has been treated. So yeah, I think they need to somehow find a way of responding. And of course, one of the other problems, if I'm honest, is, and it sounds a dreadful thing to say, is that the Queen has just lived too long. Normal institutions regenerate in a quite a sort of sensible pace, so that you make little changes as the new leadership comes into role. But she's been there for absolutely ever. And so nothing can change because she's at the helm. And then the next person that comes along also will be very old and completely infiltrated. So there's no breathing space for the monarchy to sort of simply and organically reinvent itself as it goes along in the way in which most healthy institutions would.
I wonder if you can see the parallels between the monarchy and the Church of England, perhaps in this respect. We were speaking before we opened the doors to everybody else about the fact that there seems to be an interchangeable civil service at the top.
Yeah. Well, the guy who's the Secretary General of the General Synod of the Church of England is someone called William Nye. And guess what? Before that, he was Principal Private Secretary to the Prince of Wales. And Archbishop of Canterbury's Chief Press Officer, the Director of Communications, is a woman called Ailsa Anderson Cole, and she was the Queen's Press Secretary. So they kind of move from one to the other and have a similar way of operating. And I can see that Meghan would go in thinking, I'm fresh blood and I'll be able to do things differently. But actually, it's quite a sort of nested way in which they relate to each other and to the outside world. Thank
you. Can I turn to David Muir now, Dr. David Muir from Roehampton University. You were telling me yesterday when I spoke to you that you were going to watch all 2 hours of it last night with your family. I wonder if I could ask you, first of all, what was your response having seen and heard it?
Well, I mean, Ruth, I did actually watch it with my family and my notebook. And I was, I suppose what actually struck me, and of course, listening to what Ted said earlier on, we are talking about an ancient institution with its ecology, its morphology, its rituals and practices. And of course, like any new institution, outsiders have got to actually learn the rituals. They've got to understand something about the emotional and attitudinal sensibilities. And what struck me, and I was very, very surprised, was Meghan's claim that she really wasn't inducted or introduced to some of these rituals, some of these esoteric things that are associated with monarchy. And of course, last night, before I watched the program, I was on the Zoom call, a Zoom seminar hosted by Professor Anthony Reddy at the Oxford Centre for Religion and Culture. And of course, last night we had no other luminary than Dr. Rowan Williams. And of course, Rowan was talking about culture and how cultures change and they're fluid. And of course, in his normal erudite way, Rowan gave us a really, really good understanding of some of the challenges. And then I raised with Rowan, this kind of idea of the metaphor. Many, many years ago, one of our seminal Black academics, Professor Paul Gilroy, wrote a book entitled There Ain't No Black in the Union Jack. And of course, many people have interpreted that as a metaphor for Black exclusion. And so when I hear Meghan talking, and of course, you've got to take seriously someone's feelings, Meghan's sense of bewilderment, a sense of being lost. And of course, what was even more shocking was when she talked about the fact that she was in a dark place and needed help. And there was, she really didn't get any help. I think that would worry viewers because, if someone is saying that they are almost suicidal and they're in an institution like the monarchy and they cannot get help, I think there's something needs to be said about that. But I think I was fascinated in what I saw. And when I listened to some of the vitriolic coverage on places like Good Morning Britain, and I heard Piers Morgan, I think, well, okay, did you actually really see those 2 hours? What I took away from that was a young couple who was struggling with the rituals of monarchy, a young woman, an outsider, a woman of dual heritage who felt that she was getting a very, very hard time. And when she needed help, that's the sad thing, when she needed help, there was no one there to actually help her. And I think, I must give Harry a lot of praise and credit. It's almost this kind of, Miltonian idea that at the end of the day, you've got to hold your lover's hand and walk away in order to actually protect her yourself and your family. Yes, of course, there's going to be lots of fallout. Yes, of course, there's going to be more discussions about race and about racism. But I think, as Ron Williams said last night, if we listen carefully and if we listen attentively, there is still a lot of learning that needs to be had, because you're looking at an institution where a large degree of conformity is necessary. If you have an outsider who has not been inducted, you're going to have a lot of problems, because at the end of the day, you have an institution that needs to be reformed. And of course, reformation doesn't happen overnight, it takes time. And maybe Meghan, for us, when we saw the wedding, gave the possibility of a gradual reformation of the monarchy by having a woman of dual heritage. So I was not as disturbed as I heard a lot of people, but I do think we need to listen and learn and to take seriously. If people are complaining about their feelings, about their mental health, and they are suicidal and they cannot get help, I think that is a real indictment.
Can I just take you to the nub of the complaint, which was around racism? The Washington Post headline says that the interview indicates racism lingers in this royal family. Do you think that's correct?
Well, listen, racism is often a shorthand for woolly thinking, okay? Racism, we're talking about institution, we're talking about structures, we're talking about history. The royal family has been part of, the kind of Western world adventure, its representation in the Commonwealth. So we can't talk about race in any meaningful way without talking about historical institutions. You don't see too many Black people in the royal family, do you? All we're saying is that race is still going to be that kind of a lingering thing. And one of the real touching moments for me in that interview was when Meghan talked about one day she was with Her Majesty, and Her Majesty has had a blanket across her knees, and she basically invited Meghan to share her blanket. Now, isn't that the kind of wonderful thing that any grandmother would do, any person would do? So what I'm trying to say is that, I don't want to get caught up in whether or not the monarchy is racist or not racist. I want to say, what are we doing to change the institution so it is more representative of the signs and symbols of a modern Britain, which is multicultural, which is diverse, which is dynamic.
Thank you. It's a good point to bring in Dr. Bob Morris. Thank you, David. But Bob, you're researching European monarchies. You're in this research project at UCL, which I suppose may come up with some suggestions and proposals for how we redefine monarchy, perhaps in taking account of the way that David was describing there. I wonder if I could ask you for your reflection on what this episode has shown about the way that the monarchy ought to be transformed for the future generations.
Well, thank you. And most interesting to hear what has so far been said. What we did was look at the 8 European monarchies of any size. The Scandinavian monarchies share with us a requirement in their constitutions that they are members of a particular religion. In all the cases, the state religion as it is locally defined. And most of them seem to have adapted much more than I think has been suggested over time. They are all very popular normally. I don't know what the effects of the Meghan and Harry affair will be. They have done this, and they adopt roles which not only are impartial constitutionally, that's the great strength of their position. They are not involved in hurly-burly of daily politics. The way in which the selection of the head of state is constructed means that no politician can aspire to the head of state role. In my opinion, that's quite an important function. What they have done in terms of those who are obliged to follow a particular religion is generalize their religious role in the sense of extending it to cover all their citizens, whatever their religious background may be. I think the Queen made a very important statement about this, which I'm sure many of you will remember, right at the beginning of her Golden Jubilee year at an ecumenical event in Lambeth Palace. And I'm sorry if I may bore you, but can I just read what she said? The concept of our established church is occasionally misunderstood, and I believe commonly underappreciated. Its role is not to defend Anglicanism to the exclusion of other religions. Instead, the church has a duty to protect the free practice of all faiths in the country. And the Queen of Denmark and the King of Norway have made very similar points. And you find this is one of the mantras that bishops in the House of Lords adopt and try to practice. This is a new role that, of course, abandons the views of the minority Christian groups and their treatment in the past, but that's another matter altogether. So I think there's a clear lead from the monarchy about the way in which we should behave to all religions.
Just can I ask you, just one more question, and then I've got questions coming in the chat box that will come to you next. But can I ask you this? You think the monarchy will survive this?
The institution, yes. It's far too early to see what damage of a continuing kind will be done by these kind of revelations. We have only got one side of the story, no doubt. Other sides will emerge.
Thank you, Bob. Can I just bring in Christopher Lamb here? And I think you've got a question actually for Bob as well.
Yes, thank you. So my question is that the Queen is respected because of her service and her duty, which is grounded in her Christian faith. But obviously the next generations of royals don't see their service in the same way. And so we see the monarchy becoming embroiled or synonymous with celebrity and the culture wars. Would the panel agree that the secularization of monarchy poses a very serious threat to its future?
The secularization. I always thought that the constitutional political roles are dominant in the relationship. That it's true there have been enormous changes in people's attitudes to religion. We know now that a little over 50% of the population have no religion, profess no religion. And the forthcoming census may show us how far that has changed, backwards or forwards. And I'm not sure that the great deal of weight has ever been put in modern times on the religious role of the monarchy. Constitutional commentators at the beginning of the last century were claiming that they thought that the religious understanding of the monarchical role had really fallen away in most cases. There's evidence that in the 1950s, there were some people, about 30%, who believed that God had actually chosen the Queen. But that was not by then a dominant belief. And I think to put too much weight on the religious importance of the role is to misplace the real centrality of their functions in our society, which are to do with expressions of the continuity of our society, the way in which the monarchy has embraced other groups, despite the current accusation of racism and so on. Things have changed much more, I think, in the monarchy's behavior than they are given credit for, particularly at this moment.
Thank you, Bob. I don't know if any other panelists would like to come in and discuss this. Meanwhile, please put other questions in the chat box. Rosie.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking that this could actually be a very good moment in all sorts of ways. I think it could serve to demythologize the institution such that the conversation we're just having about the necessity for a head of state role becomes a job. A bit like the Queen of Denmark, actually. You do it, you do the job, but you don't have all the accoutrements which actually make people, it's a bit cheesy and it's for the tourists. And somebody does it and does it well, and they do it for an appointed time, and maybe you can retire at 70. I mean, even the Pope, the previous Pope, got to retire in the end, and you pass it on to the next generation, and it becomes much more a very important job and a role, but the mythology around it just doesn't sit with our present way of looking at life. So it could be quite a healthy way of moving things forward.
I think the Anglican Church and the monarchy have also grown apart, not just society growing apart from the monarchy's religious raison d'etre. If you look at again, going back to the coronation service, which was within the context of a communion service, using the high Anglican words of the Book of Common Prayer. Most Anglicans these days, a diminishing number of people, are rooted in common worship and the Alpha Course. There's very little that they will identify with in the coronation service. So the next coronation, I think, is going to be a very interesting thing, because it's going to have to be rewritten. It's going to have to keep some of the ancient in it, because I'm sure that King Charles will want that. But at the same time, it's got to be something which is going to be recognized by people at large, if the monarchy is going to retain significance for the people at large.
Like what exactly, Ted?
Probably the whole thing has got to be restructured. In the old coronation service, there was a huge role for the hereditary peers, for instance, the dukes and the earls and the viscounts taking their coronation oaths and so on. You had within Westminster Abbey, a very, very ancient, and in parts of it faux ancient ceremony. I think we saw a glimpse of what might happen in the Diana funeral. The Westminster Abbey team moved things on and was able to introduce some new elements into it. I'm not saying that we're going to have Elton John at the next coronation, but something will have to be done to rewrite not only the liturgy, but actually to recreate the theology of what coronation is.
The theology of what coronation is. I wonder if anyone could take a stab at that, David, perhaps?
Well, I mean, I was fascinated by what Ted was saying, but I think institutions morph, don't they? They change. They sometimes they actually transgress, and I think we've got to ask ourselves: we are living in the 21st century. What are the signs and symbols that we need to maintain, which are useful, which are historically important, and what are the things that we need to actually include? So yes, I heard someone say we wouldn't necessarily have Elton John, but the question is, why not? Would you have the Kingdom Choir, for example? So I think what we're trying to say is that, these things are very subjective, and there may be people, younger people, will be asking, why do we need a monarchy? We have, we have democratic sensibilities which are totally against ideas of deference. And however one looks at it, the monarchy represents deference. It actually represents a certain group of people being treated radically differently because of their heritage. All I'm saying that we need to have a conversation, and maybe, Rosie said, and I know what she's saying, because the Queen has been there for such a long time, it actually impedes change. But, I think what this episode will do, and it must force the royal family, the institutions, the men and women that work with them to ask themselves some serious questions about what image are they given of a modern Britain. Because you see, there comes a point at which people will decide, they'll vote with their feet. Why should we have a monarchy the way in which it is presently constituted in the 21st century? Those are questions that I think we need to actually have. And those are the questions that people need to think about seriously. Historical institutions are good things, of course they are, but we shouldn't be imprisoned by them. We should be informed by them, but not imprisoned by them. And many people will see some of our ancient institutions, even the Church of England, have got rituals and symbols they're maybe not terribly helpful in the 21st century.
Thanks. I saw Stephen, you were reaching behind for a book during all of that. I wondered if the abolition of the monarchy registered at all in your understanding of what might happen next.
No, I don't think so. I mean, the monarchy, despite everything we've been saying, is hugely popular in this country. It fluctuates a little bit between sort of 2/3 and 3/4. And partly it's because no one has come up with an alternative that would secure majority backing. The monarchy has always evolved. Back in the 1950s, you can look back to the start of this Queen's reign, simply because she's reigned so long, and see how much the monarchy has changed in the last 50 or 60, 70 years coming up. So I remember one royal personage talking to me years ago about the Marmite strategy, which was how the monarchy changes without seeming to change. Like a Marmite jar, the Marmite jar has been altered, redesigned, reconfigured lots of times in the 100 years since the sort of horrible brown paste was invented, but no one notices because it still looks like a heritage product. And that was more or less what the monarchy sought to do. Things that it does today, not just because of modern technology. The Queen has a Twitter account, though I doubt that she actually uses it personally. Inconceivable. And just as the coronation in 1953 was very much an Anglican affair, it's inconceivable that the next one will be entirely Anglican, even though it will be in Westminster Abbey, possibly. So I think while the monarchy evolves without seeming to evolve, and the coronation continues to evolve as it has done over the centuries, there's no longer the sort of anti-Catholic rigmarole that there was in the 19th century, which even Queen Victoria thought was a bit excessive. Probably it will go on. People actually like the tradition and the flummery, and they even find a certain degree of comfort, I think, in the spiritual aspect of the monarchy. Not that they necessarily believe it or believe in God, or certainly not go to church anymore, but they like the comfort of it sort of having an importance which they sort of realize, but don't sort of think through in any great sense.
Thank you. Andrew, I think you have a question. Andrew Brown?
No, it was simply that I spent some time a couple of years ago thinking about this question of what the next coronation oath should be, because if you actually read through the service that was used in 1953, it couldn't possibly be used again. And it is, as everybody has said, very, very deeply religious. But one of Linda Woodhead's students did a little project on this to find out what people actually thought. Going out and asking people, fairly random sample, in the co-op, wherever, did they think that the coronation service was too religious, too Christian? And it had never occurred to them that it was. This wasn't a question of ignorance. She showed them videos, the old black and white newsreels of the coronation service, and at the end, would say, do you think that's too religious? And they hadn't clocked at all that it was a religious service. It was just tradition. So I don't think there's going to be any serious theological objections to the content of the coronation service. The idea of doing something symbolic to make it more multi-faith, multicultural, however you want to put it, is clearly much more pressing. And I think that the Meghan brouhaha will have strengthened the case for that.
Great observation. Thank you, Andrew. I wonder, in some of the time that we have left, if we could turn our attention to what actually will happen in the immediate future. And Rosie, I'm going to put you on the spot. If you were advising the royal family faced with this kind of incident in family life, in full public glare, what would your pastoral insight be and advice to them?
I think that in the end, somebody speaking from the heart, which is what has got everyone's empathy for Meghan, somebody speaking from the heart and genuinely saying, this has been very painful for all of us. And there are bits of it we've got badly wrong. And we want to reach out and try and rebuild relationships and just articulate what we know they surely must be thinking, would be hugely helpful. Very few times that the Queen has actually said, this has hurt, or this has been a difficult year, there's been a massive outflowing of empathy and support for her. It's when you just try and carry on as if nothing has happened and people have to imagine what you might be thinking that things go AWOL. I think the identity thing is interesting as well, because what Andrew was saying about tradition, I think there's a mismatch between people who think the monarchy is kind of like a movie or something, that it's not actually real, and people for whom it's grounded in reality. And Meghan was, the curtsy story is a prime example. She genuinely thought that when they were out and about, people curtsied because that was part of the act. But come on, you don't actually curtsy to the Queen indoors, do you? But of course you do, because the monarchy actually believe in themselves.
Yes.
They don't think it's a story, they think they're real. And I think there's a mismatch there, which is really fascinating.
Oh, David, as another ordained person on the call, what would your advice and counsel be? We've got lots of clergy on the call. Very happy to get your views. But David first, if I could.
Well, I mean, I would agree with a lot of what Rosie said. It seems to me that, listening to the program, there is something about HR and pastoral care. I don't know how they're going to do that, but it cannot be that difficult. Even within the close circle of Buckingham Palace, if someone is suffering, if someone is struggling, they must be able to go to someone. There are chaplains, and we know how important mental health is and how it's becoming such a big issue now. I was very, very saddened to hear Meghan, say that she was suicidal and she went for help, and she was told because she's not a paid member of staff, they can't do anything for her. I mean, what is that about? So I would just say, like all institutions, my own institutions, if my staff, my colleagues, students are in trouble, they've got people they can go and actually see. We call them, student welfare officers. The palace needs some welfare officers who can take care of people like that when they run into difficulties.
Okay, we go to Sebastian Miller then for another question.
My question was, I've missed this. There hasn't been. I wonder whether this risks being something of an echo chamber, because I haven't really seen anyone ask any very critical questions of, what degree of merit there might be in these accusations, as to, whether there might be problems with, celebrity culture in the media. And I'm also a little surprised that so many people in a religious context take it for granted that nobody identifies with the monarchy, no one sees any religious significance in it. It's a foregone conclusion that it's all out of date. I'm not sure that's where a lot of ordinary people may have a rather vague idea about the monarchy, but I don't think that people are desperate to get rid of it or see it change in huge ways. That's almost entirely coming from British elites.
We just hold that question for a minute. We'll bring Catherine Pepinster as well in, please.
I'm interested in the extent to which, with the Queen, we see a very strong idea of sacrifice. I think it comes from her, or perhaps best one could say vocation. In her 21st birthday speech in South Africa, she talked about God make good my vow, and this was reflected again in the coronation. This sense that she commits her life to the extent of almost sacrificing herself think this has strong religious connotations, and I don't see evidence of that amongst the younger generation. And I'm wondering, if that goes, what would replace it? Do we think that there is an idea of sort of vocation to the point of sacrifice in even how Charles sees his role, or how William might? What does being a member of the royal family now mean in that sense?
Who would like to take that one?
I think I think that spiritual identity has been replaced by the thing that the Queen talks about as much these days, which is duty, the sense of duty rather than some sort of spiritual sacrificial role. And clearly throughout her reign, and increasingly in the last 20 years, she's talked about her religious faith, which comes across very strikingly in the annual Christmas broadcast, when for once in the year she speaks unmediated to the public. I suspect Charles has similar feelings about duty. I think Harry has shown that his conception of duty is rather different, and William is more in his father's image than Harry, and perhaps that's better for the institution.
The sacrifice word is very loaded, isn't it? Because sacrifice, it can only be sacrifice if it's voluntary. And you get born into the royal family, and if sacrifice is demanded of you, it's almost borderline abuse. You can't demand sacrifice from somebody. You have to give sacrifice voluntarily. And if you don't believe that that's what your life should be doing, forcing someone into it is a very difficult and unpleasant thing to do. Sacrifice is a very loaded word when you expect it of other people.
Oh, but I wonder if you have a reflection. Sorry, yeah.
I came across a very interesting quote written by Sir Harold Nicholson at the time of the coronation in 1953, in which he said, "The Queen is dedicated almost as a sacrificial victim to the service of God." Now, there's something enormously primitive in that as well. And I think the members of the royal family, the current generation, the younger ones, Harry in particular, and certainly Meghan, have not even thought in these terms. They don't actually know what the role of the monarch is. Harry was born into it. He's known no other life until he met Meghan. He hadn't really thought in detail, why am I here? What am I supposed to do? It was just what he was born into, in the way that in medieval times, if you were the son of a blacksmith, you became a blacksmith. There was no choice.
Stephen Patterson, I don't know if you want to unmute your mic and take part. You've put a really interesting observation in the chat box.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's really just a comment to say that this clash between the sacrality of the individual who chooses, which has become prominent in our society, we're all supposed to choose and our choices are supposed to be respected and so on, is very different from living in a society in which you think that you have been called from before, perhaps before the beginning of the world, who knows, into an institution where you don't have any choice. And I think many of us find it very difficult, not to say almost revolting, that somebody, a young person being born into a particular family, is constrained in the way that the younger members of the royal family are talking about. And that's one of the things that makes some of us feel we want to be Republicans, because we want to respect that choice and freedom. And we sort of think this is no longer what sacredness is about, being stuck in an institution and just doing your bit for 20, 40, 80 years with little choice as to whether you want to be a dentist or a doctor or whatever it might be, even a helicopter pilot.
I wonder whether this mistakes what sort of political arrangements we have. The monarch has been a salaried tenant since 1688. We live in what's essentially a republic, with the trappings, of course, which were inherited from the past in various ways and which have been changed. And the language of obligation has changed over time. What was once appropriately framed in the notion of sacrifice is now turned into something rather different, as people have already commented, into one of duty. And whether you accept the vocation or not is something which is available to people. There's always been a problem for membership, continuing membership of a royal family, which demands certain norms and behaviors for those who are not going to actually inherit the crown. The problem of the spares, if you like. And we do too little, perhaps, to equip those close to, but not ever likely to succeed, to consider alternatives for themselves if they were open to them and wished to take them. And we see that with the sort of group of people who are members of the royal family, but even further away than Harry, that a lot of them have opted very sensibly for creating careers of their own. It is possible to reject the vocation, which is what, of course, Edward VIII did in whatever turbulent circumstances. And I'm not sure that we can use language usefully nowadays that heightens religious perspectives on the role, because they are clearly out of tune with the way in which most of the world now seems, at least in Western Europe, to regard these things.
Can I just very briefly say that I think the British public certainly respect the idea of duty. What they really resent is the sense of entitlement. And I think that Harry and Meghan got quite close to seeming entitled, and certainly various other members of the royal family have done so over the years. And I think the thing that will most undermine the institution is the sense of entitlement. You see it in the political sphere, where political leaders assume that they are entitled to do various things. I'm thinking of refurbishment of the Prime Minister's flat, that sort of thing. People really resent, but they like the idea of a figurehead who pursues duty, and that's what the Queen has done in an exemplary fashion for the last 7 decades.
Thank you. I know we're closing in a moment, but I think we have to take this question from Leo Netto. I don't know if you're still on the line. Yeah. Leo, would you like to make your point in person?
I can make my point in person if that helps. Wondering about racism. It's a very big accusation against an institution or a person. And what would the panel have to say in terms of the role of the media in propagating any racial prejudice against Meghan? We have said a lot about perhaps the church, the monarchy, but we haven't said very much about the media. What was the role of the media in creating this storm? Thank you.
That's probably one for Stephen first.
Yes. I think the media were really warm and welcoming of Meghan when she first arrived, and at the wedding and so on and so forth. I think what went wrong, and what she, or certainly some people have claimed as racist, was actually criticism. The British media likes to criticize, and if it sees things that it doesn't like, it doesn't spare the criticism. Now, there, I think, undoubtedly have been racist tinges to some of the things that have been said about Meghan Markle, and they're utterly reprehensible. I think to tar the whole institution or even the culture as racist is excessive. On the point that came out of the interview about the color of the baby's skin, well, one would like to know more of the circumstances in which it was said and by whom. It may have been certainly misguided. Whether it was actually meant in a racist way, maybe more problematic. We've heard, as I think Bob said earlier, half the story. Last night I observed on the American media things being said by the late night hosts about Charles's Basset hound ears and medieval inbreeding, which I don't think you get in the British tabloids, and yet the British tabloids seem to be the only part of the media that Harry and Meghan observe. And I think, as I said earlier, entitlement is a bit of a problem there.
Thank you. I don't know if Paul Verley, you're on the call, whether you are in a position to speak and on the call. I know a lot of people listen when they're doing other things, but you've put something in the chat box here that you've written in the Church Times why Meghan is the villain, not the heroine, in the British royal fairy tale. I don't know if you are there just to expand on that before we close.
It's to do with the stereotypes of the fairy tale. Meghan is black and Kate is white, and extrapolate that through all the fairy tales you know. Kate is married to the first in line. Meghan has got to come behind. Meghan goes to Australia and is very popular. We saw that dynamic with Diana unsettling people back home. There are lots of factors which play into the lazy stereotypes that the media love to peddle. And the piece in the Church Times that I wrote last year, which I've just linked into in the box, looks at non-lazy ways of exploring stereotypes, which people like Angela Carter did, and contrast that with the media.
And it's to do with fairy tales then. I find that extraordinary.
Well, you know, fairy tales are not trivial children's things. They are deep archetypes which speak to real mythic truths in people's lives.
I would definitely agree with what Paul is saying. And also there's this kind of trope, isn't there, about, you know, even the thing about Meghan being a bully. If you are a strong black woman and you speak your mind, you automatically become a bully. So I think we just need to be careful with some of these tropes. And the media, even the avocado story, all we're trying to say is that the media must take some responsibility for creating a culture that speaks into some of those prejudices that we all know too well.
I'm sure that the media's role in the next few days is to hear the other side of the story and to get at the truth.
I think what will certainly not happen is that the media will not be put under sufficient scrutiny. And it seemed to me the one thing that changed my mind about my preconceptions when I watched the interview in full last night was the extent to which the royal family are frightened of the media and really subject to a kind of emotional and moral blackmail by the media.
To the extent that they organise fictitious garden parties at Buckingham Palace. I think none of the media who listened to that could remember an invitation.
Well, I've been to one.
Have you?
Yeah.
An invitation to the tabloid press, was that?
No, it's just to a garden party.
Can I just say I went to two parties, receptions for the media, which the royals organised at the time of the Golden Jubilee and then at the time of the Diamond Jubilee. And the Duke of Edinburgh inimitably approached a group at the Golden Jubilee and asked where they came from. And the editor of the Independent said, "I'm from the Independent." And the Duke said, knowing of the Republican tendencies of the Independent, "Why on earth did you come?" And the editor of the Independent said, "Because I was invited." And the Duke said, "Well, you didn't have to come." And it was a sense of getting their own back. It wasn't a sense of cozying up to the tabloids. The tabloid editors thought it was wonderful. It got them out of their offices.
Well, when I was New York correspondent for the Times, I was invited to a media party at Harvard University by Prince Charles just for the media.
Has anyone got any reflection on the manipulation of the media by arranging an interview of any side I'm talking about now with a lack of due interrogation?
Well, they're all at it. I mean, of course, that's what they do. You know, they see us as tools. They're not terribly interested in you know, an interview like that is a means to an end. It's a political move. It's got absolutely nothing to do with wanting to be interrogated or to get at the truth.
But the royals, as far as I'm aware, don't do what celebrities do and say you can't ask about this, you can't ask about that, which I've had happen several times.
But do people ask them anyway?
Not if it's a private interview. I'm a written journalist, so if I was interviewing someone and I asked about something that it would have been agreed that we wouldn't talk about, the person just said we agreed we wouldn't talk about that.
Yeah.
Carry on with this interview, withdraw that question or move on to another one.
Well, it'd be interesting to see who does the next interview anyway in this continuing story.
I think when the historians come to write the history of the monarchy in 100 years' time, although it's a big story at the moment, the Harry Meghan interview will not be much more than a footnote of curiosity in the book.
On that note, thank you very much, Ted. Thank you to all our panelists for sparing the time. Thank you very much for joining us this week, and we look forward to seeing you again.